So the first thing I want to talk about is my approach to choosing project and part numbers and how I use those to name files. So when I'm picking a part numbering system, there's a few things I keep in mind. One, I want the numbering system to be done in such a way that if I download a bunch of files from a project and sort them alphabetically in a file browser, they have some sort of logical ordering to them. This helps with quickly identifying which files go with a certain company, time frame, project number, and then also seeing which part files go with which assembly files. This can be helpful just when you're looking through your files, or especially if you're sending a block of files out to an external company for 3D printing or laser cutting, just keeping everything organized. The second thing I want to do is include a way to have some human readability to the numbering or naming. So when you see a bunch of files, you're not just looking at a string of numbers, you also have some readable names so that you can quickly see what file's what without opening it in a previewer. And then the third thing I want to consider is keeping the system such that it requires minimal items to be tracked in an external spreadsheet. So I don't want to constantly be referencing a spreadsheet to see which part numbers I've used. I want it to be something I can cleanly just look at the file I'm working on or the folder I'm working in and quickly see what's the next available number. So I'll switch over to some text boxes and show you what I personally like to use currently. Okay, so when I'm making a name for a file, I want to include a combination project and part number, and usually the structure I'm using is having a project number followed by a assembly number followed by a part number. So what this means for sorting is that when these files are sorted, you'll first see everything grouped by project, then by assembly, and then under each assembly you'll see the associated parts in the order that they're numbered. So the first part of this, the project number. The system I use for project numbering has a few different elements to it. So first I'll put in the initials of the company I'm currently working on. So for this series of videos, I'll just call this example company. So that would be EC. You might not need this if you're doing all your work for one particular company, but I do this because I do a lot of consulting where I have parallel projects going for different companies I'm working with. So after that, the next thing I'll put in is the year. So in this case, 2023. Then I'll put in a project number in 2 digits, so I'll just say 01. So that way, for a given company and given year for that company, I can have up to 100 projects going, so that way it leaves me lots of room to separate out different projects I'm working on that year. And then final thing I'll include is a variation number, which I'll start at 0. Usually I just leave that at 0. Where this comes in for me is if I'm working on a project and I want multiple copies of a specific project going in parallel. So it's not like a version 1, version 2. It's more of I have this file that I'm happy with that is say an electric version. And now I want to copy that and make a copy maintained in parallel that's a pneumatic version. So it's 2 parallel things, not a version 1, version 2. For version numbering, I will either add on additional version numbering at the end of a part number later, or I will use the built-in version control in Fusion 360. And then any projects I work on for this company this year under the same group, I'll always start with that and then vary the assembly and part numbers. So assembly numbering, I will separate with a dash and have a 2-digit assembly number. So I would always start a project with an assembly 00, which would be my top level main assembly. And then as I go on making sub-assemblies for this, I would then go 01, 02, etc., moving on. Now, if I was creating an assembly file and saving it, when I named the file, I would start with this number, then add an underscore, and then put in a readable name. So this gives me something that the sorting is very controlled by this part number in the order I want it, but then there's still a readable name attached to it that you can quickly see what it is. So then, like if I had a subassembly here, that would be subassembly 1. Okay, so that's what I would name an assembly file. Now let's say I'm ready to start making parts in those assemblies. Typically I won't make any parts inside the main assembly. I'll just let that contain only subassemblies that are placed into it. So I'll start with the subassembly. And let's say under the subassembly I wanted to create a part. So to do that, I'd start with the same number I have in the subassembly and then add an additional 3-digit part number and readable name, part 1. So what this means for sorting is you'd have your main assembly, your subassembly and associated parts, and then if you added an additional subassembly, it would show up next in the list with its own associated parts under it. So let's say this is subassembly 2, 2, 2, and 2. Now notice the part numbering, I restarted the part number at 001 for this second subassembly, which I can do because I already incremented this number. So this means I don't need to keep track of a running part number that, would have part 001, 002, 3, 4, because one, then I've got to track it, and two, what do I do if I want to add a third part to this subassembly? It could end up being 1, 2, 5. By doing it this way, including the subassembly number on the parts, this resets every file, so when I'm working on this file, I can quickly see what numbers are already used. And subassemblies, I can quickly look at the folder and see which subassembly number is next up in line. So that summarizes my approach to creating part numbers and project numbers and how I name files. In the next video, I'll show how I actually use this in Fusion 360 and how I structure folders in a project, making use of this naming system.